In this video, we are going to be coding the client.py file. Coding the client is going to be much easier because remember, the function of this client file is that once it's running on a friend's computer, it's going to try and connect to our server. And once it's connected, it's just going to wait for our instructions, and that it is going to get with our send commands function that we built in our server.py file. And once it receives the instructions, it's going to run them, and then it's going to take that result and send them back to our server where we will print out the client response. Anyway, so let's get started with building our client.py file. So the first thing we are going to import is a socket because we need to connect this client.py file to our server, and for that sockets are important. Then we are going to import an OS, and then the third we are going to import is a sub process. Now these two are important because without them we are not going to be able to execute the instructions that the client.py file is going to receive, and that is where these two packages come in handy. The OS stands for operating system, and sub processes are basically processes that exist on a Windows computer. Anyways, so the first thing we are going to do is create a socket because obviously we want it to connect to our server. So we'll create a variable just like in server.py, and we'll create a socket by socket.socket. Then we are going to create two variables. The first variable is host and the second variable is port. The port is going to be 9999 just like in server.py. Make sure that the port in the server.py and the client.py are the same. They don't have to be 9999, but I'll recommend you go with this number. They can be any other number, but whatever the number is, they should be same in server.py and client.py. Then in client.py, the host or the IP address is going to be the IP address of the server. But because we haven't created the server right now, so we are just going to use the IP address of my local computer for testing purposes. So to find your IP address, you can just type in ipconfig if you are on Windows, and you can type in if.config if you are on Linux.config if you are on Linux or Mac. So I'll just scroll up and my IP address should be somewhere around here. Let's see. Yeah, this is the wireless LAN adapter that I'm using, and my IP address is this. So let me just type it out. 198.168.0.105. Now that we have written down the values of host and the port, it's time to bind them together. But binding the host and the port in a client is a little bit different from server.py file. So in server.py file, we bind the host and the port together by using the s.bind function. In s.bind function, the host is the local IP address, that is the server's IP address, and we don't need an actual IP address, so we are using the s.bind function. But in client.py, we need to use another function to bind the host and the port together. It's called s.connect, and in the same way as of s.bind, we'll create a tuple. We'll first write host and then port. And this is the way in which we bind the host and port together with the socket. If you ever forget about this or have any kind of confusions, you can always go back to this slide, which basically tells you what kind of functions are used in server and what kind of functions are used in client. So as you can see, in server we first bind it, then listen, then accept, but in socket we just connect and then write and then read and then further on. So I'm going to be attaching this presentation in the lecture notes so you can have a look at this too. Now that we have binded a socket, the next thing we are going to do is create an infinite loop just like in the server. And we are creating this infinite loop because we just don't want one instruction to happen and then it should stop responding. What we want is that a lot of instructions could be sent to the client, and a lot of instructions should be executed by client.py file. For that, this infinite loop of while is important. Now to receive data from the server, we'll need to create a variable, let's call it data, and inside this data we are going to use the socket to receive some information. So we're just going to write s, that stands for socket, and then we are going to use the receive function. And inside this receive function we need to give it a buffer size. So the buffer size can be 1024, and this is the amount of chunks in which data is going to be received onto our computer or onto the server's computer. Now that we have created the data, we are going to do some kind of data checks which are important because, for example, let's say we open up a command prompt, and let me just clear the screen first, and we type in a command like echo hey, and it gives us an output of hey. But what if we type in a command, for example, like cd and ... It's not giving us any output. cd basically stands for change directory, and cd doesn't give us any output, it just takes us back one directory. And what if we want to get back to user PC? We can just type in user PC again and press enter, and it's going to take us back to user PC, but it is not giving us any kind of output as in case of echo hey or maybe dir. So we need to have some data checks in place so that we can know what we have to do if for example we type in cd. So how is the client going to handle that? So for that we are going to create a data check. So we'll just write a if statement, and I'm going to explain. First I'm going to write it down and then I'm going to explain it to you. So first we'll write an if condition and we'll write data, that is basically the information that we received, and inside this we are going to take the first two characters and then we are going to decode them, because if you remember, when information is transferred from one computer to another, it's not transferred in the form of strings, it is transferred in the form of bytes. In server.py we actually converted it into bytes by using this str.encode statement. Now that we have encoded it in server and we are receiving it in client, we need to decode that data to a string. So inside this decode we'll write UTF-8. This is just a character format, and then we are going to test whether whatever the first two characters of the data are, whether they are equal to CD or not. So what this as a whole statement does is that first it decodes from bytes to a string, and then it takes the first two characters of the data that we received and it checks whether the first two characters are CD or not. So whenever we type any kind of command in CD, so for example CD and then space and then some kind of command, the first two characters are always CD, and that is what we are trying to check over here. But for example, if we typed in dir, then the first two characters are not going to be CD but DI, and this if statement will fail to execute. Now that we have checked for the CD statement or the CD instruction, we actually need to execute the CD statement on the client's computer. So for that we are going to use this OS package. What we are going to do is write os.change directory, which is basically chdir function, and inside this we need a path. So the path is basically whatever we type after CD. So if we type in user PC or if we type in double dots, this is the portion that we have to include inside this change directory function. So we'll include that. So for that we'll just copy this first line and we'll paste this inside here. Now this statement actually gets the first two characters after decoding it into a string format, but what we want is that we should get rest of the characters after this third character. So what we are going to do inside this data, we are, instead of the colon and the 2, we are going to change it to 3 and then colon, which is going to give us the result that we need. So this basically, this means, this line means that, for example, if we type in cd user PC, this line will contain the information of user PC, and because we are using the function of change directory, it will change the directory to this user PC directory. So guys, I think this has been a pretty long video, so I'm going to end it over here. But in the next video, we are going to complete this client.py file. So I'll see you over there.